Good morning. You are tuning into this Intuitive Public Radio. I am Megan Elizabeth Morris, your regular community co-host. It's a morning. It is morning. Morning is here. Also, the dawning of experiences we have only begun to grasp the significance of. We have a list this morning. We have a list every morning, and we do our very best to communicate what's on our lists, because what's on our lists tends not to be on other people's lists. And if it were a subject of recreation, things might be different. Instead, we find that it is a subject of life and death, and that if we do not communicate sufficiently and effectively, our colleagues die, and lies are told about why. And those who truly care for our well-being mill around in bewilderment and misunderstanding while we are unable to bring our contact with accuracy into the conversation. It's very confusing to find oneself in such a landscape. It seems that one has been made strangely invisible. And this is something that we talk about in a lot of different ways. People talk about being invisible. People talk about experiences being invisible. People even talk about populations that are invisible, but is this what they mean? Is this what they're referring to? When we talk about sex trafficking, we talk about the purposeful invisibilization of certain kinds of people. If you are a sex trafficking organization and you learn how to make people invisible to one another, not in only a if you are a sex trafficking organization and you learn to make people invisible to one another, not only as in the feeling that we all are in some way familiar with, I feel invisible, there is this sense of invisibility, but to a much greater extent than that, to the extent that people can be seemingly present with one another and have no understanding of one another. Wow, can I even explain it? Can I describe it? Is it indescribable? No, I doubt it. I don't think it's indescribable, but we are having to practice. There are strata of invisibility that affect all our lives in astonishing ways. And people who are being made invisible and having those experiences recognize this kind of conversation pretty quickly. And people who are familiar with some kinds of invisibility, but themselves have not been targeted with particular forms of invisibility, they often seem to think that they understand what we're saying. But then we reach an impasse and it is no longer possible to communicate. We have loved ones, friends, colleagues, allies who are affected by this, where we maintain what communications we can, but we know for a fact that these loving, courageous people would be responding very differently if they understood that we were being physically tortured to death, and that this is an ongoing situation that is not inexplicable, that is not undetailable. It requires a more patient, steadier learning to understand one another's languages because of the ways our languaging has been separated. Intuitive Public Radio is here, we have found, to document how this is occurring and how unnecessary it is. There are certainly amazing blessings in learning how to recognize these intersections. Learning to recognize these intersections is necessary. There is a lot of unconscionable suffering that can no longer be categorized as we didn't know what to do. There wasn't any way we could reach them. We had to just keep going and do what we were able to do. That is an important category. That category is relevant in a lot of situations. But in this situation, what we find is that communications are targeted purposely in ways that stop people from recognizing one another or communicating. And when that's happening, we have to think very differently about what's going on in our communities. We have to think very differently about how we choose to communicate with one another, how we choose to respect one another. The way that sex trafficking can continue invisibly is if we make our peace with not being able to reach one another when it is possible to reach one another. If we believe that we cannot be in fuller communication with people who are more severely affected in our environments, we will not be in fuller communication with them. And the trafficking will continue because trafficking organizations understand how you have to come to that decision point and make your decision on the basis of the information you have. If they have been acting in your environments to prevent you from having information about how sex trafficking is occurring invisibly in your environments, the sex trafficking will continue. One of the major preoccupations of people who are in the midst of these intersections but do not realize it is that they need to be in deeper, more present contact with a sense of honorable sexual vitality and life energy. The conversation may seem to not be about sex, and yet the conversation is still about sex. When people are suffering and they don't know where the violence is coming from, to access their source of strength requires contact with honorable sexual vitality and life energy that has not been co-opted, that has not been twisted or redefined into being something that it wasn't in the first place. And everybody everywhere has been affected by these power structures that clamp down on any discussion of sex or try to shift any discussion of sex to only occur in a way that does not threaten those power structures. As a result, when sex trafficking is occurring in all of the environments we have examined, yours likely included, we can only come to understand sex trafficking intersections in order to prevent sex trafficking by centering robust, honest conversations about honorable sexual vitality and life energy. We, as survivors of sex trafficking who have been severely disabled and otherwise severely affected by our experiences, did not expect to be the ones hosting this conversation. We found that there are no sexual health professionals capable of joining us in this conversation. If you may know an exception, please put them in contact with us. There are powers of respectful communication where systemic communications of violence has been acculturated. You may have been acculturated to believe that there's nothing you can do about hardship and violence occurring in your communities. People who reach out to you with urgency, in desperate need, are people you do not need to keep your distance from. And in fact, it harms you as well as them when you keep your distance from them. Trafficking organizations use systemic communications of violence to make us invisible to one another and to make us feel a deep helplessness and hopelessness about trying to be in contact with one another, trying to know one another, trying to learn from one another. This could not be possible. There's too much stress. I have too many obligations. I have to do these things in this way or else this other thing. And that's legitimate. For so many people, we are all experiencing that. And we have been heretofore unaware of the power of respectful communications and how we are affected by trafficking organizations having adjusted our larger media organizations so that we would continue to be unaware of the ways we are helped or harmed by the greater media body that we are associated with, if we have a greater media body that we are associated with. If we do not, what we find out is that our bodies stop working in a number of ways. And it's important to recognize how much the environment is always a part of our bodies, a part of our relationships. When trafficking organizations have stepped into our media environments to there's so many words I could use, to build artificial components where natural components should have stayed. They have given us media bodies we haven't thought twice about necessarily, although a lot of people are recognizing the violence that media organizations are perpetuating because they misrepresent certain things or because they conduct certain conversations in certain ways. We are made invisible to one another because our greater media bodies were created to be artificial, greater living bodies to replace the roles of our real present communities, so that we're getting what feels like nutrients from our media environments, but we're supposed to be getting nutrients from our communities that are honest, that are resonant in real relationship. And people don't tend to realize that the nutrient structures have been substituted in this way because it requires some particular realms of expertise. I find the only people talking about it are people who are familiar with Marshall McLuhan, for instance, people who are familiar with different kinds of professional public media environments, people who have done deep research on how a community is necessary for a living organism to thrive. The organism, the community, and the environment are a kind of gradient. Where do I leave off and my community begins? Where does my community leave off and the environment begins? Where do I leave off and my environment begins? What responsibility do I have to be the environment to others in my vicinity? Do I impact others as a component of their environment? Do I impact others as a member of their community? Do they have anything to do with me? Yes. Yes. Yes, the answer is yes. When these kinds of systemic communications violence have been facilitated and compounded and normalized in all of your environments, it takes some time to learn to recognize them. And the swiftest way to learn how to recognize them is to be in consistent relationship building contact with people who have had to recognize them for survival, for being alive at all. Those of us who have had to recognize the powerful nature of respectful communication, wherever these systemic communications violences have been facilitated to continue occurring. What that means is that people who are very severely affected and left for dead, assumed to be dead, and even if we communicate directly with others, we are treated as if we're not really there. People run different verbal scripts for their interactions with us, but they don't seem to get a match, and they don't have other scripts, so there's no contact. Have you ever tried to have a real conversation with a Furby? I haven't, but I've thought about it. When we are all able to recognize together how powerful respectful communications are, in light of our recognition that our greater media bodies have been co-opted, in light of the isolationist tactics of sex trafficking organizations, and in light of how it is only possible to become visible to one another as part of a growing trust-oriented relationship. What we find as survivors of the most violent and invisible intersections is when respectful communications are consistently restored, repaired, bodies that have been deprived of all other recovery resources can still make sudden, amazing bounds in physical recovery. And that's not just a few people here or there. In our experience, everywhere we have implemented this, it has been everybody. We find everybody to need these modalities. We find everybody to need to be using these tool sets to understand one another, to prevent conflict, because these solutions are based on the real infrastructure that sex trafficking organizations have constructed in order to do all of that direct and ambient violence. When we identify it accurately, we can bring solutions effectively, and then we are successful and we celebrate.